Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 210 and it's titled Dino-Storm. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So our random card this week was suggested to us by Vintage over on Discord, and that is Ion Storm. An Ion Storm is 2 in a red for an enchantment, and it is 1 in a red. Remove a +1/+1 counter or a charge counter from a permanent you control, and Ion Storm deals 2 damage to any target. So this is a super unique card. There's not a ton of payoffs for just removing counters and then being able to do damage. So I wanted to try to work that into the deck. And there were a couple of cards that were floating around in the Discord that worked very well with it. But when it came time to pick a commander, there was one that really stuck out to me, and that was Indoraptor, the perfect hybrid. And yes, I know looking at this card, it is very expensive, $22. It is by far the most expensive card in the deck, but I just think it works so well in the command zone that I tried to make it work regardless. But Indoraptor is 1 and a hybrid black-green and a red for a 3/1 legendary creature, Dino-Storm mutant, has Bloodthirst for X, so when it enters the battlefield, it gets X +1/+1 counters, where X is the damage dealt to your opponents this turn. Then it also has Menace and Enrage, so whenever it's dealt damage, choose an opponent at random, then Indoraptor deals damage equal to its power to that player unless they sacrifice a non-token creature. So this is one of those cards that can get a ton of +1/+1 counters and is also a great way for us to pay for Ion Storm, because if it comes in with 10 counters, we don't need all 10 of those counters. We can remove 1 or 2 and just kind of dish out some damage as we please. But that is the commander, that is what we're working with. And so now let's take a look at some of the themes of this deck and break down what exactly we're trying to do. So first up, we of course have +1/+1 counters. And one of the most efficient ways that we can put +1/+1 counters on our creatures is with something like Rite of Passage, which is 2 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature you control is dealt damage, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So this is kind of a unique way for us to generate +1/+1 counters, because if we use this with Ion Storm, we can actually remove a counter from one of our own creatures, do damage either to itself or to a different creature, and put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. So we're not technically gaining any +1/+1 counters, but we're also not losing any of those counters either. We're net neutral overall. Obviously, you just got to make sure you're not putting so much mana into it and so many counters into it that you kill your own creature. Obviously, avoid that. But it's also one of those ways that we can just kind of manipulate what's going on the board. If we're attacking or blocking, it makes combat math really difficult for our opponents, because if they want to block our creatures, they're gonna get bigger. And yes, they could die in combat, but if they know that they're not going to die, then it becomes a very tricky situation of, do you want to take the damage, or do you want to let our creatures get bigger and then take more damage later? So Rite of Passage really works well with everything that we're putting together in this deck, and is a great lead into some of the other themes we've got going on. And speaking of some of the other themes we've got going on, we of course have our second theme, which is to do damage to our own creatures. So our commander, Indoraptor, has the Enrage ability. Obviously, not everything's going to have the Enrage ability, but a lot of our creatures care about being dealt damage, and if we have something like Pestilence, which is 2 black for an enchantment, at the end of each turn, if no creatures are in play, sacrifice Pestilence, and you can pay a black, and it will deal 1 damage to each creature and player. So yes, this does hit us, yes, this hits our own creatures, but that means that if we have Indoraptor in play, and as long as it has a single +1/+1 counter on it, so it obviously doesn't die to Pestilence, it would then have 4 power. We activate Pestilence, deals 1 damage to everything, including Indoraptor, which then deals 4 damage to an opponent or forces them to sacrifice a non-token creature. And if we have Rite of Passage, we then put another +1/+1 counter on that creature. So now, if we have Pestilence and Rite of Passage, we can actually never kill our own creatures with Pestilence unless they start with 1 toughness, because as long as it's got 2, we deal a damage to it, it gets a counter, then we can deal more damage, get more counters, and just so on and so on. And then obviously we can eventually remove those counters with Ion Storm to do more damage to our opponents or to our own creatures. And with all of that being said, we obviously have our third theme of the deck, which is modified. Since we are putting so many +1/+1 counters on our creatures, we may as well also lean into the modified synergies to take advantage of that actual win condition. Because having a bunch of giant creatures is great, but there's always a chance that someone can interact with us, so we want to make sure that we're getting advantage from our creatures even if we're not attacking. And a great way to do that is with something like Invigorating Hot Spring, which is 1 red and a green for an enchantment. It enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+1 counters on it. Modified creatures you control have haste, and we can remove a counter from Invigorating Hot Spring to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control, but only as a sorcery and only once each turn. So this is one of those cards that by giving our creatures haste, we're able to very quickly overrun our opponents, and this puts us in a position where no matter what, our opponents may not be able to have full information of what's going on our side of the board. Being able to drop a massive threat, which could be our commander, make sure that we're swinging in for some damage, maybe we've got Rite of Passage and Pestilence and other ways to kind of mess with the combat math. This can put us in a situation to easily win the game through combat, but also gives us enough advantage, whether it's card advantage or anything else, to put ourselves in a position where we don't necessarily need to win through combat damage if that becomes impossible. So those are our themes for this week, and the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some key cards. These are cards that really synergize with what we're trying to do, are sometimes win conditions or value engines all on their own. So the very first card that I want to talk about is going to be Quilled Great Worm, a relatively new addition from Foundations. It's 4 green for a 7/7 worm. It has trample. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage during your turn, put that many +1/+1 counters on it, and we may cast the Great Worm from our graveyard by removing 6 counters from among creatures you control, in addition to paying its other costs. So this is one of those cards that if left unchecked can really run away with the game, because this is just a 6 mana 7/7. If it hits somebody with no blocks, it does the full 7 damage. Then all of a sudden we get to put 7 +1/+1 counters on it. It's now a 14/14. It hits again, we go to 28. We hit again, we go to 56. So this is one of those cards that if it's not dealt with in 1 to 2 turns, it can grow so big that there's not much our opponents can do because it has trample. And the same can be said for a lot of our creatures. If we're doubling our creatures' power and toughness every single turn with +1/+1 counters, there's not much that's going to stand in our way. And being able to recast the Great Worm by removing counters means that as long as we can get in some hits while it's in play, or even just use some of our modified synergies, there's always a chance that we can just keep recurring this thing after our opponents kill it, and kind of have that inevitability to win the game. Moving on to our next key card, this one is going to be Touch of Moonglove. And you may be wondering why a common from Magic Origins has made it into our key cards. But because of everything we've talked about, this is actually a very powerful piece in our deck. It is 1 black mana for an instant, and it simply says target creature you control gets +1/+0 and gains Death Touch until the end of turn, and whenever a creature dealt damage by that creature dies this turn, its controller loses 2 life. We have a lot of creatures that can just deal 1 damage to every creature our opponents control. So if we give that creature Death Touch, that automatically just becomes a one-sided board wipe, just clearing away the rest of the board. And every creature that dies that way is going to make its controller lose 2 life. So as long as we have something that can do damage, we can give it Death Touch with Moonglove, and then we can really just take control of the board. And once we've done that, there's no one to block. We can just very easily swing into our opponents, and there's a very good chance we can win the game on that turn. So while Touch of Moonglove doesn't look very powerful, it can actually be a win condition if we set up properly for it. And then finally, we get to our last key card, and this one is Spore Web Weaver. So we talked earlier about creatures that want to have damage dealt to them. This is one of those creatures. It is 2 and a green for a 1/4 spider. It has reach and hexproof from blue. And whenever it's dealt damage, we gain 1 life and create a 1/1 green sapperling creature token. Now, as weird as it is, it's actually the life gain that's going to be the most important thing to us and not the token. Because if we're doing 1 damage to every creature, it's just going to kill the sapperlings anyway. But if we're using something like Pestilence to do 1 damage to each creature and player, being able to gain a life every single time we activate that means that we net neutral in our life while our opponents are going to keep going down. So we can do 1 damage to each player, gain a life. We have stayed where we were. Every one of our opponents is now at a lower life total. So if we are activating those abilities 2-3 times a turn, we can essentially be bolting each of our opponents, making them lose 3 life, while we are staying where we are, and that makes us pretty much out of reach for a lot of our opponents. It makes it very difficult for them to come back from that because we're just consistently doing damage. We're consistently making bigger and bigger creatures, maybe even putting them in a situation with our commander where they have to sacrifice a creature or take a ton of damage. So it really just makes us, well, I guess for lack of a better term, it kind of makes us archenemy, which is a weird thing to say about a card that just gains you 1 life. But with the way that our deck plays, that is kind of accurate for how it plays out. But those are all of our key cards. And the next thing I'd like to do is take a look at some cool interactions in the deck. And these are cards that synergize really well with each other, and in some cases are just fun interactions and fun cards that I just want to highlight. So the very first card we're going to talk about is Deathbringer Thoktar and Basilisk Collar. So we talked a little bit earlier about how giving something Death Touch can be very powerful. Basilisk Collar is another way to do that. It's 1 mana for an equipment. An equipped creature has Death Touch and Lifelink, and it equips for 2. In this case, the creature we want to equip it to is the Deathbringer Thoktar, which is 4 black-red for a 3/3 zombie beast. Whenever another creature dies, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Deathbringer Thoktar, and you can remove a +1/+1 counter from Deathbringer Thoktar, and it'll deal 1 damage to target creature or player. The way that this works is if we have Basilisk Collar on Deathbringer Thoktar, all we have to do is get at least 1 creature to die, or find another way to just get a +1/+1 counter on the Thoktar. At that point, we can remove the counter from the Thoktar, do 1 damage to one of our opponent's creatures. Because the Thoktar has Death Touch, it's going to immediately die, plus also gain us a life because lifelink, and that's sweet too. And then once that creature dies, we put a +1/+1 counter back on the Thoktar, which can then be removed to kill something else. So once again, this is a one-sided board wipe, essentially allowing us to just shoot down every single one of our opponent's creatures, gaining 1 life for each creature destroyed this way, and then we still have the Thoktar. It'll end with 1 +1/+1 counter on it, so we can hit somebody for 4, gain 4 life. Maybe we've got our commander, maybe we've got some other giant creatures. And if we have something like Quilled Greatworm to go along with this, the Thoktar can get out of hand so incredibly quickly if it's not dealt with. So I'm a big fan of both of these cards. I've never really been able to make the Thoktar work in some decks, but I think this might be a good home for it. Moving on to our next cool interaction. This one is between Mephidros Vampire and Walking Ballista. So once again, this is very similar to the Thoktar and Basilisk Collar combination, but slightly different as well. In this case, we have Mephidros Vampire, which is 4 black for a 3/4 flying vampire. Each creature you control is a vampire in addition to its other types, and it has, whenever this creature deals damage to a creature, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. Then we have Walking Ballista, which is XX for a 0/0 artifact creature construct. It enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters. You can pay 4 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on Walking Ballista, and you can remove a counter from Walking Ballista to do 1 damage to target creature or player. So in a very similar vein to the Thoktar Death Touch combo, if we have 2 +1/+1 counters on Ballista, make sure it's not just one, you don't want it to automatically die, you can remove a counter to deal 1 damage to any creature, then you can put a +1/+1 counter back on the Walking Ballista, essentially giving us a way to just shoot down our opponent's entire board, leaving us as the only player with any creatures, and in a position where we can very easily win the game. Now, you will also notice Walking Ballista, a very expensive card, $10.95. That is one of the cards that I really tried to squeeze into our budget because it goes infinite with quite a few different cards in our deck. So if there is a game or a pod of people that you're playing with and you know you don't want infinite combos, I believe that if you remove the Walking Ballista, you take out all of the infinite combos, except for dealing with creatures, but I'm talking about actively winning the game. Then you can remove the Ballista, and I don't think there should be any infinite combos. Please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but that's why it's in here. It is a very powerful card and definitely something to pay attention to when you have some interaction pieces on the board. But those are our cool interactions for this week. And the next piece of this is to take a look at our budget this week. So this week we came in at $95.73, so very close to our budget limit. And we've already talked about our most expensive card in the deck, that is Indoraptor. Now, if we're being perfectly honest, you could replace Indoraptor with another Jund commander, but there's none that really do what Indoraptor does. And there's none that really offer this finality to the game. It is in itself a win condition, and it's something that we will use to end the game in most of the games that we play with it. So if you do replace it, then maybe you can put something in that's maybe not quite as threatening, but I also don't think the deck is going to run quite as smoothly without it, so that is something to be aware of. On the other hand, if you're looking to add a card to the deck to increase the price of it, but also increase the power, I do have a suggestion for you there as well, because the card I would recommend putting in this week would be Silver-Clad Ferocidons. And Silver-Clad Ferocidons is 5 red for an 8/5 dinosaur. Whenever it is dealt damage, each opponent sacrifices a permanent. Now, it is very important to state here that this says permanent, not non-land permanent, not non-creature permanent, any permanent. So if we can deal enough damage to this over the course of the game, we could quite literally make our opponents sacrifice all their creatures, artifacts, enchantments, planeswalkers, and their lands, plus anything else they have in play. So obviously that's not going to be the most efficient. It is very difficult to pull off, especially because it is 7 mana. But I do think it's worth it in the deck, because even just making everyone sacrifice, say, 2 permanents every single turn is enough that we can just skyrocket ourselves ahead of the rest of the table and put ourselves in a winning position. Obviously, though, if you're putting a card into the deck, you do also have to take a card out of the deck. So in this case, I would recommend taking out Hexavus, which is 6 mana for a 0/0 artifact creature construct. It enters with 6 +1/+1 counters, it has flying, and you can pay 1 to remove a counter from it to put a flying counter on another target creature, and you can pay 1 and remove a counter from another creature you control to put a +1/+1 counter on Hexavus. Most of this is in here because it deals with +1/+1 counters. We can give our creatures flying, but it doesn't really reward us for the +1/+1 counters in the way that I was hoping it would. And in my playtesting with it, it just kind of felt like a 6 mana 6/6 with flying most of the time, which is not really what we want. As bad as that sounds, that's actually pretty far below our rate. So that is something to be aware of putting the deck together. It's obviously not a bad card by any means, but it's definitely one that is a little bit underpowered for what we're looking for, especially when compared to Silver-Clad Ferocidons. Now, that, though, brings us to the end of our deck tech, and before we get into a game with this deck, because obviously we got to get a game in, see how it performs, I do want to take a second to highlight some ways that you can help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. So as always, a shout out to all of our patrons and channel members, and a huge thank you goes out to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Tyler Esme, Sven von Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Jakar, Galen, Brian Holiday, Richard, The Oak Monster, and Tuku Spooner. So to all of you, thank you all so much. And if you would like your name listed among these amazing people, please do check us out over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. The link to that is in the description of the video. And if neither of those are your things, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit as well. So before we move on from the actual shoutouts and the Patreon mentions, I do want to also showcase something that my patrons and our Discord have been telling me, and that is that I should be showing off the tokens that we send out to the $7 tier at the Patreon level, because I mentioned that I send out cards, which are the random cards we build around, but I also draw little tokens to go with them to make sure that there's a little bit of fun and uniqueness to all of them. So if you would like to receive some of these perfect and amazing, wonderfully hand-drawn tokens, because I am definitely an artist, as you can tell by these, wonderful tokens, then you can also sign up at the Patreon at the $7 tier, and you will get some of these amazing tokens as well. But with all of those shoutouts out of the way, let's move on to a game and see how our deck can perform and hopefully walk out with a victory. So this week, we are being joined by Bilal, who's playing Storm, Force of Nature, Vintage playing Elesh Norn, and Jason, who's playing the Wise Mothman. Starting off with Bilal and his Storm deck, this is mostly meant to be an extra combat deck. He wants to hit someone with Storm and then cast an extra combat spell to be able to take multiple extra combats, storm off, and just, quite literally storm off and just kill people with Storm in combat multiple times in a single turn. We have seen this deck on the channel before. It didn't quite get the chance to pop off, so let's see if this week is any different. Next, we have Elesh Norn being played by Vintage, and this is kind of a mono-white, I want to say good stuff, kind of mixed with tapping effects. He kind of wants to control the board and put his opponents in a position where they're forced to either lose life to his commander, pay mana to his commander, or just not attack at all. So it's definitely a unique take on the commander, especially because on the backside of Elesh Norn, you've got the Argent Etchings, which can act as a board wipe. So he really does want to play this almost mono-white control style deck, which I think is super cool and super unique. And then last but not least, we have Jason playing the Wise Mothman, and I will tell you right now, this is easily the deck that I am the most afraid of. Normally it would be Storm, but I have died to the Wise Mothman so many times. I have a massive amount of respect for this commander because it grows just so massively large so quickly. And Jason's deck is, of course, no different. It wants to give everybody a bunch of rad counters. It wants to proliferate. It wants to hit people with the commander. So there's definitely a lot of ways that this can grow lethal very, very quickly and start knocking us out of the game. So I think that's my pick for the most concerning deck at the table. But I would also love to hear what you guys think. So let me know down in the comments who you think is going to walk out the winner this week. Let me know who you think is going to win. Get those predictions in. As always, if you haven't already, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. But let's jump into this game. Hopefully everything goes well for us, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by Vintage, Jason, and then myself. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a Stomping Grounds tapped. Vintage plays a Bucolic Ranch. Jason plays a Mortuary Mire. I play a Swamp and cast Retribution of the Ancients, which lets me pay a black mana to remove X+1/+1 counters from among creatures I control to give target creature -X/-X until the end of turn. Bilal plays a Breeding Pool tapped. Vintage plays a Plains and casts Gold Vein Pick. Jason plays a Viridescent Bog, then cast Hardened Scales, now putting an additional +1/+1 counter on his creatures whenever he puts +1/+1 counters on them. I play a Forest. Bilal plays a Forest and casts Farseek, searching his library for a Ketria Triome, putting it into play tapped. Vintage plays a Plains and casts Sunset Pyramid, entering with 3 brick counters. Jason plays an Ash Barrens and casts Cultivate, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand. I play a Mountain and cast Crypt Rats, letting me pay X black mana to do X damage to each creature and player. Bilal plays a game trail, revealing a forest so it comes into play untapped, then casts his commander, Storm, Force of Nature. Vintage plays a plains and casts his commander, Elesh Norn, now making any opponent either pay a mana or lose 2 life whenever they deal damage to him or his permanents. Jason plays a swamp and casts his commander, the Wise Mothman, giving each player a rad counter when it enters or attacks, and lets him put a +1/+1 counter on a number of creatures he controls, equal to the number of non-land cards milled by any player. On my turn, I mill a non-land for my rad counter, losing the counter, losing a life, and Jason puts 2 +1/+1 counters on Mothman. I then play a forest and cast a temperamental Oozewag, giving all my modified creatures trample. On Bilal's turn, he mills a non-land, losing his rad counter, losing a life, and then Jason puts 2 more counters on Mothman. After that, Bilal plays a Rockfall Veil and attacks me for 3 with Storm, but before damage he casts Manamorphose to draw a card and make 2 red mana. This means that once Storm deals damage to me, he's able to cast Overpowering Attack in his second main phase, giving it Storm thanks to his commander, and creating an additional copy of it, giving him 2 additional combat phases. With those 2 combat phases, Bilal again attacks me with Storm, meaning I've taken 9 damage from Storm this turn. On Vintage's turn, he mills a non-land, losing a life, losing his rad counter, and letting Jason put 2 more counters on Mothman. He then plays an Idyllic Grange, putting a +1/+1 counter on Elesh Norn, then he equips his commander with Goldvein Pick, giving her +1/+1, and letting him make a treasure token whenever she deals combat damage to an opponent. After that, he activates Sunset Pyramid, removing a counter from it to draw a card, and finally he attacks Bilal for 5 with Elesh Norn, making a treasure token. On Jason's turn, he mills a land, then casts Tireless Tracker, investigating whenever a land enters under his control, and putting a +1/+1 counter on the tracker whenever he sacrifices a clue. He then plays a Darkwater Catacombs, making a clue, and attacks Bilal for 9 with Mothman, giving everyone another rad counter. Then, in his second main phase, Jason casts a Nuka Nuke Launcher. On my turn, I mill a non-land, losing my rad counter, losing a life, and letting Jason put 2 +1/+1 counters on Tireless Tracker. Then I play a forest and attack Jason for 4 with the Oozewag, letting me, in my second main phase, cast my commander, Indoraptor the Perfect Hybrid, entering with 4 +1/+1 counters since an opponent lost 4 life this turn. On Bilal's turn, he mills a land, then plays a forest, and attacks Jason for 3 with Storm. Before damage though, he casts Great Train Heist for all of its modes, meaning he gets an additional combat phase after this, gives his creatures +1/+0 and first strike, and also makes a treasure token when his creatures deal damage to Jason this turn. This has Jason taking 4 damage from Storm, while Bilal makes a treasure, and then he attacks Jason for 4 again, making another treasure. On Vintage's turn, he mills a non-land, losing his rad counter, losing a life, and letting Jason put 2 counters on Tireless Tracker. He then casts Linden the Steadfast Queen, letting him gain a life whenever he attacks with a white creature. He then attacks Bilal for 5 with Elesh Norn, gaining a life and making a treasure token. On Jason's turn, he mills 2 non-lands, losing both his rad counters, losing 2 life, and putting 2 +1/+1 counters on both the Tracker and Mothman. After that, he plays an island, making a clue, and equips the Nuka Nuke Launcher to Mothman, giving it +3/+0, Intimidate, and whenever it attacks, giving the defending player 2 rad counters whenever they cast a spell until Jason's next turn. This lets him attack Bilal for 14 with Mothman, giving each player a rad counter and forcing Bilal to block with his commander, killing Storm, but preventing Bilal from dying to commander damage. In his second main phase, Jason casts a Bloatfly Swarm, entering with 6 +1/+1 counters and removing counters equal to the damage dealt to it, giving each player that many rad counters instead. At the end of turn, I activate Crypt Rats for 1, doing 1 damage to each creature and player, killing the rats, removing a counter from Bloatfly, and giving each player a rad counter, but also triggering Indoraptor, doing damage equal to its power to a random opponent, and in this case it winds up doing 7 damage to Bilal. On my turn, I mill 2 lands and pass. On Bilal's turn, he mills 2 non-lands and a land, losing 2 life, losing 2 rad counters, and Jason puts 2 counters on Mothman and the Bloatfly. Bilal then plays a Tarnished Citadel and casts Expropriate, getting 2 rad counters and letting each player vote to give him either an extra turn or have him gain control of one of their permanents. Before the spell resolves though, Vintage activates Sunset Pyramid to scry 1, and I cast Return of the Wild Speaker to draw 7 cards since I control a creature with 7 power. Then Expropriate resolves and ends with Bilal voting to give himself an extra turn, while Vintage, Jason, and I vote to give him control of one of our permanents, so he takes Indoraptor, Mothman, and Elesh Norn. On Bilal's extra turn, he mills a land and a non-land, losing a life, a rad counter, and putting a counter on Mothman. Then he casts Regrowth, returning Time Warp from his graveyard to his hand, casting it and getting an additional turn after this one. After that, he moves to combat, attacking Vintage with Elesh Norn, and attacking me with Indoraptor and Mothman, giving each player another rad counter. Vintage takes 5 while I block the raptor with my Oozewag, killing it and, unfortunately, being the random opponent to take 7 damage from Indoraptor anyway once it's dealt damage, also taking 16 from Mothman. On Bilal's next extra turn, he mills 2 non-lands, losing 2 life, 2 rad counters, and putting a counter on Mothman, then cast Pyretic Ritual, making 3 red mana, cast Kodama's Reach, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting one into play tapped and the other into his hand, plays an island, and cast Echo of Eons, making each player shuffle their hands and graveyards into their libraries before drawing 7. Once that's resolved, he attacks Vintage for 5 with Elesh Norn, and attacks me for 7 with Indoraptor, knocking me out with my own commander. Vintage, though, blocks his commander with Linden, killing her and losing 2 life, rather than taking another hit from Elesh Norn. On Vintage's turn, he mills 3 non-lands, losing 3 life, losing 3 rad counters, and letting Bilal put 1 more counter on Mothman and Elesh Norn. He then plays a Plains and casts a Soul Ring before activating Sunset Pyramid to draw a card. Once that's resolved, he casts Karn the Great Creator, preventing his opponent's activated abilities of artifacts from being activated. Then he activates Karn's +1 ability, turning his Goldvein pick into a creature with power and toughness equal to its mana value, notably making it fall off of Elesh Norn. On Jason's turn, he mills 2 lands and a non-land, losing a life, losing a rad counter, and Bilal puts a +1/+1 counter on Elesh Norn. Jason then plays a forest, investigating, and casts Vault 12 the Necropolis, giving each player 3 rad counters. On Bilal's turn, he mills 3 non-lands, losing 3 rad counters, losing 3 life, and putting a +1/+1 counter on both Mothman and Elesh Norn. He then plays a Spire Garden and casts Primal Amulet, making his instants and sorceries cost 1 less to cast. This lets him cast Nexus of Fate, taking an additional turn after this one and shuffling the spell into his library. After that, Bilal attacks Vintage for 22 with Elesh Norn and Mothman, giving each player a rad counter. On Bilal's extra turn, he mills 2 non-lands, losing 2 life, losing 2 rad counters, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and Elesh Norn. He then plays a Thorn Spire Verge and casts Chaos Warp on Jason's Bloatfly, shuffling it into his library. Then he reveals the top card of his deck, putting it into play if it's a permanent, which it is, so Feral Ghouls come into play. This allows Bilal to attack Jason for 16 with Mothman. Then in his second main phase, Bilal casts Chandra's Ignition, having Mothman do damage to each other creature and each opponent equal to its power, doing 16 to both Vintage and Jason, which is more than enough to knock them both out, winning Bilal the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot happening there. I know our deck got a little bit, well, I was going to say stuck, but we just couldn't quite find the pieces we needed. We did do a decent amount of damage, and I think if we'd had a couple more turns to set up, we could have really just gone off on the rest of the table, but not quite what we needed. And then once our Indoraptor got stolen, it was all kind of downhill from there. Moving around the table, getting to Jason, Mothman really was the MVP of this game, because not only did it put pressure on the rest of the table, but once the Mothman was stolen, then all of a sudden it started taking out everybody else. So I think that Mothman really was the key player in the game, as it usually is in most games, and it just further reinforces just how powerful that commander really is. Next up, we got Vintage and his Elesh Norn deck. Also did a very good job. I think Elesh Norn kind of being this unbreakable wall that just can sit there and attack and still remain on defense is kind of underrated. And having this ability to generate treasures and card draw through some of his artifacts was very cool and very impressive. And I think Elesh Norn is one of those decks that hopefully we will get to see again, because I think there's definitely a lot of space that it can play around in that makes it super, super cool and super unique. But we, of course, also got to talk about our winner of the game, Bilal and his Storm deck. And Storm, well, she stormed off, did what she wanted to do, but I think it was also very telling that he didn't copy any spells more than once. He never got a storm count higher than 1 because he was able to take extra combats or maybe just deal some damage and then take extra turns, and that alone was enough to get him the win once he had a consistent board state. And you can obviously point back to the Expropriate being the winning spell of the game, getting just that one extra turn that he got for himself and then taking everybody's commanders meant that he was able to just take a couple more extra turns, start knocking people out of the game, and I think by the end of it, Bilal took 3 additional turns, which is definitely more than enough. I think that put him closer to turn 11 and the rest of us closer to turn 8, which definitely means that he was in a much better position to win the game. So very impressed by Storm. I think that if she's built right, she can be an absolutely terrifying commander, and as much as we got our butts kicked by extra turns and extra combats, I am glad that we didn't see any actual Storm coming out of the Storm deck. So that's at least something, but let me know what you think down in the comments. Let me know how our deck functioned in your eyes, if there's any cards you think we should remove or cards we should add to it. I would love to hear all of those suggestions. But other than that, thank you all so much for watching. Thank you all so much for, of course, liking and subscribing to the channel, as I'm sure you all already have. And I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.